Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Advocacy 101, the legislative process and meetings with elected officials. My name is Gabrielle Ross. I am a housing advocacy organizer here at NLIHC, and I hope today the information will be helpful to you all, whether you're attending our policy forum on March 24th for our virtual Capitol Hill Day. Our virtual Capitol Hill Day on March 24th. Our policy forum is 22nd to the 23rd. Or if you plan on scheduling meetings with your elected officials in the future. First, a few housekeeping notes. The slides and recordings of the presentation will be available on our website, and you'll also receive a follow-up email with the slides and recordings. And if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please be sure to use the Q&A box on your screen rather than the chat box. And throughout the webinar, we'll be taking breaks to answer questions. And today, alongside me, I'll be presenting with Cindy Betancourt, Courtney Cooperman, and Lindsay Duval, all housing advocacy organizers here at NLIHC. And Joey Lindstrom will be answering questions you all have in the chat as we go through. Okay. Today, we'll start out by discussing the basics of the federal legislative process and legislative and budget processes. We'll then explore why we advocate, offer tips for your Hill meetings, and walk through an example of a legislative meeting. We'll do a role play to provide an example of a Hill meeting and how to answer difficult questions, and then we'll answer any final questions from the audience. And let's start with a brief overview of the legislative process. So there are three branches of the federal government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Today, we'll be focusing on two: the legislative branch, also known as Congress, and the executive branch, also known as the White House, the administration, or the president. Congress is made up of two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House has 435 voting members, plus some delegates who represent US territories and the District of Columbia, but they don't have voting rights in Congress. Representatives are elected for 2-year terms. Each state gets an allocation of representatives based on their population, and this allocation is reassessed every 10 years after the census is conducted. The second chamber of Congress is the Senate, which is a smaller body. It's comprised of 100 voting members that are elected for 6-year terms, and each state has 2 senators. Again, there are no senators for DC residents or Americans who live in US territories. If you're participating in Hill Day, most of you should be doing 3 meetings, 1 meeting with each of your members of Congress. Now let's go over how the 2 bodies of Congress create laws. Okay. Understanding how a bill becomes a law is a very important part in your advocacy, so you know where in the process you can have the most impact. For a bill to become a law, the first step is the bill to be introduced by a member of Congress. Ideas for bills can come from the member themselves, the president, individual citizens, organizations, or companies. The president may also put forth a plan, but it's always a member of Congress that submits the actual bill. A member of Congress will take the bill idea and introduce it into their respective chamber. At that point, it receives a bill number and is posted on congress.gov, where you can track the bill's progress. Once the bill has been introduced, it then goes to committee. Both the House and Senate have committees on a range of topics. The committees that we pay close attention to are committees on appropriations, budget, Veterans Affairs, and transportation infrastructure. Committees are led by the committee chair and the ranking member. The committee chair is a member of the majority party, and the ranking member is the committee leader of the minority party. Currently, the chair of each committee in both the House and the Senate is either a Democrat or an independent, and in both bodies, the ranking member is the opposite party of the chair. The House or Senate leadership can then decide if and when they will schedule it for a floor vote. In committee, the bill is edited, also known as marking up, and then the committee decides if it will go to the House or Senate floor to be voted on, or if it will stay in committee. When a bill goes to the floor, members of Congress can speak for or against the proposed bill before the final vote. In the House, the Rules Committee determines how much time people can debate the bill, if amendments can be passed, etc. In the Senate, members can take over a debate on the Senate floor in order to prevent a vote on the bill. This is known as filibustering, which we will explain in further detail later in the presentation. The Senate can end a debate with a vote passed by 60 members. Once the bill passes each chamber, a conference committee made up of the House and Senate members meet to reconcile any differences between the 2 versions of the bill. The conference bill then goes back to both chambers where it gets voted on again. If it passes, it goes to the president. The president then has two options. They can sign the bill or they can veto it. There are multiple ways a bill can be vetoed, which we won't get into on this webinar. If the president does decide to veto a bill, Congress needs a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to override the veto. Okay, now that we've gone over how a bill is passed, I'll turn it over to Sydney to discuss the budget process.
Thank you so much, Gabby. Just making sure that everybody can see me really quickly. But my name is Sid, and I use she, her pronouns, also housing advocacy organizer, like Gabby stated. So just to cover budget reconciliation first, you might have heard of this term a lot recently, and it's a complicated process, so we won't go into it too much in depth, but there are a few things that you should know about. The first being is that it's a tool to make legislation easier to pass in the Senate, and the second is that the budget cannot be stalled by the Senate by a filibuster, which again, we will be talking about shortly, and that budget reconciliation can only be used for legislation that is, affects spending, federal spending, revenue, taxes, and the debt limit. So we're also going to drop an additional resource explaining what the budget reconciliation process is in the chat. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, Gabby. Thank you. So before we move on to the rest of the budget process, I want to quickly review two important actions, the filibuster and the cloture. So the filibuster is an action designed to prolong a debate, and it can delay a vote on a bill, resolution, amendment, or other debate on the Senate floor. And a cloture is a rule that can be enacted to end a filibuster, but this requires 3/5 of the Senate. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one important thing to know is that there's two different types of spending within the budgetary process. You'll see that there's mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory spending is automatically devoted to a program, and Congress has little control over mandatory spending. So examples of this usually include things like Medicaid, Social Security, Medicare, things that are supposed to be funded every year. And then discretionary spending is subject to annual approval by Congress. So examples of discretionary spending can include housing programs, but it also includes things like the military, healthcare programs, agriculture, things like that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here you can see an image kind of showing the composition of the federal spending for fiscal year 2019, and it shows the difference between discretionary and mandatory spending. So we're fighting for that 30% right there. Next slide, please. And then the budget process starts when the president submits a detailed budget request for the coming fiscal year. So that usually begins around October 1st. That hasn't really happened recently, but the president's request after that is supposed to be made by the first Monday of February. And as you can see, we're on March 9th now, so we'll see. But after Congress receives the presidential or the president's budget, the House and Senate budget committees propose their own budget resolutions, which set targets for spending and tax revenue. And any difference in the House and Senate proposals are resolved in conference, which again is just a small temporary committee with both Senate and House members. And then Congress has the power to add, reduce, or eliminate budget items from the president's budget. And the budget resolution for the year is adopted when both chambers pass the final conference budget bill or report. And the congressional budget resolution is not an ordinary bill and therefore does not require presidential approval. Next slide, please. Thank you. So following the adoption of the budget resolution, the House and Senate Appropriations Committee take the discretionary spending, so that 30% that we saw earlier in the budget resolution, and they divide it amongst each of their 12 subcommittees. So each subcommittee is responsible for developing an appropriate bill for their relevant agencies. And some examples of subcommittees that you might have heard of are the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee, but there's also others that are related to housing, such as Agriculture, Rural Development, and the Food and Drug Administration. Next slide. Thank you so much. So After each subcommittee proposes an appropriation bill, the full Appropriations Committee in the House and Senate mark up each bill to send to the floor. Both chambers pass their bills and iron out their differences in conference, and then a final vote is taken on the bill that comes out of the conference, and then the bill goes to the president to sign or veto. Congress must pass and the president must sign appropriations bill by October 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year, to fund all national government departments, agencies, and programs for that following year. And Congress has not passed all 12 of these bills before October 1st in more than 20 years. And this means that some agencies and programs don't have the money that they're authorized to spend. And so in other words, there'll be like no money to spend on legally established programs and national government functions. And when this happens, the government either shuts down or Congress has to pass a continuing resolution, also known as a CR, which temporarily extends current funding for programs and agencies that operate on this money. And so basically it's just like a budget extension that allows more time for debate on the 12 bills that need to pass. Another term that you often hear is sequestration. Sequestration means across the board spending cuts if a certain spending goal is not met. And sequestration is accomplished through caps on discretionary spending, which means it does not apply to mandatory spending. Next slide, please. So just some information on HUD's budget over time. Housing programs rely on increased funding just to maintain their programs. So it's important to focus a lot of your advocacy efforts around the budget. NLIHC, our state partners, and our members engage in Congress each year to make sure that affordable housing and transportation programs receive the highest amount of funding possible through sign-on letters and meetings. And though we've seen gains in the last 10 years for both tenant and project-based rental assistance, funding levels for key HUD programs have decreased since fiscal year 2010. Next slide, please. So now that we've finished going through the legislative and budget process, does anyone have any questions? You can also ask your questions by typing them in the box on your screen. I know we see Joey's typing an answer to Carrie's question right now, but Carrie asks, so is this why they try to cut entitlement programs so they can have more discretionary spending for pet projects? Joey, I don't know if you want to come off of mute or if you just want to go ahead and answer that in the chat.
Yeah, sure, Sydney. Thanks for the question, Carrie. I think the term discretionary just means that it's applied to the budget every year. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a small program or a project. It just means that in every year's budget, it might go up or down, whereas the things that are mandatory aren't decided in the annual budget, and they're funded even during the government shutdown. So that's really the difference, but it's definitely true that discretionary budget items, like most of the HUD budget, are the things that are easier for Congress to cut.
Thank you, Joey. So again, please feel free to continue putting your questions in the chat, and if we don't get to them today, we'll go ahead and follow up when we send out the materials for the webinar. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay to discuss considerations about advocacy versus lobbying.
Hi all, Lindsay Duval here. I'm also a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. So let's talk about the difference between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is when you provide information about an issue and organize support for your cause. And anyone can and should participate in advocacy, whether you're an individual or work for a nonprofit. Lobbying requires 3 components. 1, that you're communicating with decision makers like elected officials or their staff. 2, that you're communicating about existing or potential legislation. And 3, you're asking that decision maker to vote for or against the legislation. All 3 of these components are required for this activity to count as lobbying. Sometimes people assume that because they work for a 501c3, they can't lobby. Actually, 501c3 501c3s can lobby if it fits within their mission and it's an insubstantial component of their overall work. They are limited by the amount of time or resources that they spend on lobbying, though. Generally, if the organization exceeds 5% of the staff time or resources on lobbying, then they must register as a lobbyist or submit paperwork to be incorporated under the 501H designation instead of 501c3. The 5% standard is often called the insubstantial part test. So in short, you are lobbying if you ask an elected official or staff to vote a certain way on a specific piece of legislation. There are lots of great resources around lobbying as a nonprofit provided by the Boulder Advocacy Campaign of the Alliance for Justice. So I think Joey's going to drop a link to that website in the chat, but feel free to reach out to any of the NLHC organizers if you have more questions about this. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about what your role is as an advocate and how to use your knowledge of the legislative process to influence decision makers. Next slide. So there are several factors that your senators and representatives will consider when deciding how to vote on legislation. First, they might consider their political party position, meaning that they may vote based on party lines. I know we see a lot of that lately. Also, they're going to consider what their constituents value. Elected officials really do want to represent their voters and ensure them that they are listening and doing their job. And this can also help them get reelected if they seek another term. They're also going to consider their personal values, which might mean that they're considering religious beliefs when voting on a bill. And also they're considering political and financial feasibility. So you may hear your representative would love to support more homeless assistance programs, but there isn't money for it in the budget. Long-term members of Congress may avoid introducing bills or voting on bills that require any new spending. It's important to consider what you're asking your legislator to vote on. And if you're asking for a very expensive request, it may be something that has to be worked out over a longer period of time and involve a larger advocacy campaign. So considering all of this, it's important to realize that what you as a constituent value is a key part of how legislators make their decisions. They need your opinions and expertise to make decisions on legislation. And if they don't make the right decisions, you can hold them accountable by voting them out of office. Next slide. So does advocacy work? We get this question a lot at NLHC, and in short, the answer is a resounding yes. Let's see why. So when we talk to staffers and legislators, we hear again and again that advocacy is important. The Congressional Management Foundation found that 94% of legislative staffers said that when a member of Congress hasn't come to a firm decision on an issue, visits from their constituents have a positive impact on their vote. And the same study found that knowing how a bill will impact a district or a state and knowing why a constituent supports or opposes a bill is crucial in helping them make a decision. But unfortunately, the members of Congress rarely get this information from the constituents. And so that's where you come in. We often hear questions and comments like, well, I come from a very conservative state and I know my senator is never going to be a champion on affordable housing. Or I come from a very liberal state and they already support these issues. Is it still worth me taking the time to talk to them? Yes, absolutely. Let's look at this diagram. So your role as an advocate is not necessarily to take the legislator from the far left of the screen to the far right of the screen, but rather to move them more incrementally. To convince a staunch opponent to move to the opponent or neutral position can be very powerful. It makes it that much easier to get legislation passed if there aren't major objections raised about it. And on the other hand, if a legislator who was a staunch supporter isn't hearing from housing advocates, they could move to the supporter or neutral position on an issue, which could decrease the chance of the legislation getting passed. It's really important to thank and praise members of Congress who do support affordable housing and to keep them in that staunch supporter category and ensure that our issues have champions in the legislature. Our supporters in Congress always appreciate it when their leadership is acknowledged and praised. So now that we've covered the basics of how legislation moves through Congress and what your role is as an advocate, we'll discuss what a Capitol Hill or other advocacy meeting looks like and how to ensure it's successful. Next slide, please. There are a few key things to consider about advocacy meetings. First, remember that a Hill visit is just a conversation. It is happening in a place of power with people that have influence, but in the end, it's just a simple conversation. Very often, the staffer or the member of Congress you are meeting with will have less information about the issue than you do. So you will likely be the expert in the meeting. Also keep in mind that no Hill meeting is the final conversation you'll be having with any given individual. And the best advocacy is that which leads to building a relationship. So a Hill meeting is just one conversation in a series of conversations. And we'll be dropping additional resources in the chat for tips on meeting with your elected officials. But let's talk about preparing for your meeting. Next slide. For those of you attending our virtual Capitol Hill Day on March 24th, the logistics of scheduling a meeting will vary. Some states will have captains who will schedule meetings for their teams across the state, and other smaller contingents will have to set up their own meetings. If you don't know the plan for Capitol Hill Day, contact your NLIHC organizer and they will likely be in touch with you in the next week or so. Generally though, to schedule a meeting, you should call the office that you'd like to meet with and ask for the scheduler. You can request a meeting by phone or video conference. Some offices will ask you to fill out a form, but most of the time a phone call is fine. If you need help getting the name or number of the scheduler, you can ask your NLHC organizer. And please note that you have a better chance of meeting with a higher level of staff if the meeting request comes from you or an actual constituent in their district rather than one of us, but we're happy to help if needed. When you're scheduling the meeting, call about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time. So if you're attending the March 24th Capitol Hill Day, right now is the time to begin setting up these meetings if that's part of your plan. Calling earlier than that can often lead to a request to call back later. And many offices indicate that they don't know what votes will be happening that far out or which staffers will be available to meet. But of course, if you wait too long, the staff members may not have time to meet with you. Remember that there may be a time difference between Washington, D.C. and where you live, so adjust your meeting time accordingly. All meetings for this year's virtual Capitol Hill Day will be virtual. Once you confirm a meeting with the scheduler, it's a good idea to ask if you can set up the Zoom meeting and invite the member of Congress or staff person rather than letting the scheduler set it up. This way, you can start the meeting early and convene other participants to review the plan, test your audio, and be sure everybody is ready to go when the individual joins. So I mentioned meeting with staff members because in most instances, that's who you'll be meeting with. Oftentimes, meeting with staff members is just as good or even better than meeting with the legislator themselves. Members of Congress rely on their staff for key information that they use to make decisions. And it's true that when you meet with the staff, they're more likely to have more time available to explore the various issues you're discussing and to ask good follow-up questions that provide for more dialogue. If possible, try to meet with the staff who handles housing policy. If you meet with a member of Congress, the meeting is often going to be really brief because of their busy schedules. If you can, research the member of Congress and the staff person you're meeting with before your meeting, and this will show that you're interested in what they're doing and not only looking for them to be interested in your issues. And it can be helpful to establish a tone of partnership. Next slide, please. So if you're doing your meeting with a coalition of groups or with several people presenting on different topics, you'll want to coordinate your conversation ahead of time. Who's going to speak first? What issues does each person raise? And who makes what asks? If you're attending Capitol Hill Day, there's going to be a lot of resources in your Hill Day packet and on our Legislative Action Center. You may choose to discuss 3 top issues out of the many that we provide for you, But if you have policy issues outside of our materials, we encourage you to discuss them because these are your meetings and we want to make sure that you're treating them that way. Before your meeting, it's important to prepare an elevator pitch, which is the major talking points you want to discuss. If you prepare these in advance, you'll be more likely to stay on message and include the most relevant and important topics during your brief meeting. And we also mentioned that storytelling is an effective skill to use during your meeting. It can add an emotional component and help form connections with a lawmaker or staffer that you're meeting with, and points out the shared values that you might have. If you have direct experience yourself with the issue, definitely mention that. And if you're a service provider who has observed a success or challenge with the issue, also describe that. Storytelling helps to demonstrate your expertise and it humanizes the decision you're asking them to make. Housing CA recently held 2 training sessions on incorporating storytelling into your advocacy, and they also created a worksheet that will help structure your storytelling, which we will just drop in the chat. So finally, it's important to make sure that you're comfortable with the technology that you're using for your visits. And remember again that there might be a time difference between where you live and Washington, DC. Again, if you're meeting with a group, try to gather ahead of time just to make sure everybody has the materials and a clear plan for the meeting. So this is some key considerations before your meeting. Now I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to share some key considerations that you need during your meeting.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Cooperman, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer here at NLIHC. So during your meeting, #1 thing to do is always introduce yourself and your organization, if applicable, and declare yourself a constituent of the member of Congress. Your effectiveness is largely based on geography, because legislators are concerned about their own constituents' priorities, experiences, and expertise. If you're not a constituent, explain how your organization works with the member of Congress and their constituents and provide services in that district. You should use the meeting to educate your elected official and their staff members about the work that you do and the issues that you care about. And remember, if your organization does not allow you to lobby as their direct representative, you can still refer to your work with your organization as informing your perspective on any given issue during the meeting. As often as possible, you should provide data and share experiences about the issue that you're talking about. Very often, this will take the shape of numbers and of stories. At NLIHC, we work very hard to take the national data that we calculate and break it down at the congressional district or local level so that we express these facts about the national affordable housing crisis with local context, which is what your legislators really care about. And we'll share an example of that on the next slide. A second thing to remember is to connect your work to the elected official as much as possible. This is another reason why you should do research on them before the meeting. If you can connect your work on affordable housing to the elected official's interest in better outcomes for children, healthcare, the environment, whatever it may be, this will create a strong connection that will lead to a stronger relationship as you move forward. Third, always make a specific ask in your meeting. Make sure that when you talk about an issue, you connect it to the budget, a specific piece of legislation, or perhaps a Dear Colleague letter that a representative is circulating, something concrete that your representative can support or oppose. Ask a question where they can give you a yes or no answer. Most often, they might not give you a yes or no answer. They may say, this is helpful information and we will think about it. That's fully to be expected and totally acceptable. You can use that as an opportunity to follow up later, to provide more information, or to see if they have any further questions. In some cases, you may have meetings with staff or legislators who don't understand the issue very well and are considering the issue of affordable housing for the first time. In some of these instances, your meeting will primarily cover background information, and you'll be providing a lot of high-level information about what affordable housing is and why it matters. You might not get into the finer points of policy until you do a follow-up conversation, either over the phone or at another meeting, but these initial meetings are still essential as they lay the foundation for your relationship. Since you'll be meeting virtually, it's best to email materials before and after the meeting. And if you're meeting on Zoom, you can also drop them in the chat during your meeting. It will be more difficult for them to forget about you immediately after the meeting is over if you send that follow-up email with resources. You should not assume that everything you send in the follow-up will be read cover to cover, but you can definitely reference these materials in your follow-up. And again, if you're participating in Capitol Hill Day, be sure to notify your organizer what meetings get scheduled as soon as possible, so we can be sure to prepare you with the materials that you'll need on Capitol Hill Day. And speaking of those materials, on the next slide, an example of something that you can definitely send during your meeting and send in the follow-up is this congressional district profile. You can use these profiles to highlight the need for more affordable homes in your state and to support your asks. As you can see on this housing profile, the top level statistics are broken down on a congressional district level. This shows members of Congress how the issue of affordable housing touches their own district. The second level of statistics are statewide, and the third is regional, which shows statistics for metropolitan areas and counties in a congressional district. You can also find these on our website at nlihc.org under Housing Needs by State, and we'll also share that link in the chat. Next slide. After your meeting, you should take time to debrief with the other constituents who were in the meeting with you if you're there as part of a group. You should also, as I mentioned before, send a thank you email that includes follow-up resources and materials. Something else you can do in your meeting as you're wrapping up is take a screenshot of everyone who's on the screen and share that. That can be something you do in your follow-up, maybe even in a thank you tweet or blog post. This allows you to share about the meeting publicly. You can say something like, "We were happy to meet with our legislator and discuss affordable housing issues, and we look forward to working with them in the future." Publicly expressing your gratitude for members' availability and their staff is an opportunity to strengthen your relationship. It also reminds them that, of course, they're accountable to follow up on the commitments that they made to you, or to get them more information on questions that they said they needed answered. Second, you should share what you learned during a Hill meeting with your network. Share with your members, your board, your volunteers, and of course, share with us here at NLIHC. We can take the information you provide and follow up with specific action items to clarify any questions that the members of Congress or their staff might have, and to get them to engage on specific legislation. We are all in a better position as a movement when we know what outcomes there are from your meetings. And you can do this by completing the Lobby Day report that Joey is sharing in the chat. Finally, always follow up and work to build a relationship with the office. Make sure you're continuing the conversation. Advocacy shouldn't be considered something you do in just one meeting, but rather a process that begins with one meeting. So we'll pause here. Does anyone have any questions before we continue with a role play of a Hill visit? And I'll also take a look at the chat to see if anything has come in there. Oh, this is a great one from Carrie. Your members of Congress or their staff likely talk to hundreds of people. How can you stand out and be more memorable without coming off as too weird or radical? Yeah, that's a good point, especially with virtual communications, for sure. Well, I think that members of Congress, they care about what you think. So you shouldn't be worried that you're talking about a topic that's too weird for them, because if you care about it, then it matters. So definitely don't be concerned that you're bringing up an issue that maybe isn't on their mind. That's actually why these meetings matter, to bring things to their attention that might not have otherwise been on their radar. And then in terms of how to stand out, I would say the follow-up materials are really key to that, because they're so busy. They have so many people coming into their office or calling them. If you can leave something behind that they can refer back to, then that's a really great way. Also, Lindsay pointed out a really great point in the chat, storytelling. Make these issues personal. If you talk about how something affects you directly, whether that's your own experiences or the experiences you have in your work, then that's something that can really humanize the issue and say, this matters because it affects me. Here's how my story connects to this policy. Here's how my life would be different if the budget included these resources or if this law were passed. So you want to tell that story and draw a really clear connection to what you're asking them to do, because that will stand out. Any other questions? Let's see. Oh, and the slides, yes, the slides will be available afterwards. We've had a few people ask that. So yes, this will all be available it'll be available online, and we'll send out a follow-up as well. All right, if we don't have any more questions, I'll turn it back over to Gabby.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you, Courtney, Lindsay, and Sid for that information. So like Courtney said, we're going to be moving on to a role play, just because many of you may not have participated in a Hill meeting before. So we're just gonna show what a typical Hill meeting may look like. And it's going to be done by Courtney and Lindsay. And Courtney will be playing the part of the legislative assistant, and Lindsay will be playing the part of the constituent. So I'll let y'all go ahead.
All right. Hi there.
Good morning.
I'm Lindsay Duval, and I'm with the Eliminating Homelessness Coalition of New York, and I'm a constituent of Representative Smith's district. Thanks for meeting with me today.
Of course, thanks for coming in. My name is Courtney Cooperman, and I work as the legislative assistant for Congresswoman Smith. I'm sorry that the Congresswoman can't meet with you today herself, but I'm happy to be meeting with you, and will be sure to share our conversation with her.
Thanks. It's great to meet you. I'm going to put in the chat some data and fact sheets that I'll be referencing during our conversation.
Wonderful. These materials are always so helpful.
Good. So I'm here today to share a little bit about myself and discuss some key housing issues with you. As I mentioned, I live in Representative Smith's district, and I've worked at the Eliminating Homelessness Coalition now for 10 years. Over the past 3 years, I've been working closely with the Resident Advisory Board, which is where residents and shelter guests discuss their challenges and propose solutions to organizational leadership. My organization is also a member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Today, I wanted to discuss my concern about the lack of affordable homes for the lowest income households, specifically the population that I work with. We've had great success in addressing homelessness in our state with proven programs such as rental assistance and permanent supportive housing. But more families are falling into homelessness right now than ever before, and we need more funding for affordable housing and supportive programs. The support we're getting from the federal government just isn't enough to house everyone experiencing homelessness in New York.
I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you for sharing your experiences. But as I'm sure you know, we're in a difficult budget environment where we're going to have to make a lot of tough choices.
I know this is true, but it's important to see how these choices are affecting people living on the lowest incomes, like the residents in my district, in my resident action board. They want and need permanent housing with supportive services to help them stabilize and to thrive. We know what the solutions to homelessness are. We just need sufficient resources to fund them. In the materials that I put in the chat, there's a budget chart showing the level of funding for various HUD programs over the previous years. As you can see, the support for subsidized housing programs hasn't been keeping pace with our communities. If you take a look at Representative Smith's congressional district file, you'll see that in her district, there's a shortage of 15,542 homes available and affordable to extremely low-income households.
Wow, that's a really high number. So where do those numbers come from?
The National Low Income Housing Coalition compiles these numbers for each state using HUD data. I also want to draw your attention to the numbers on cost burden and severe cost burden. A household is cost burdened if they are paying more than 30% of their income on rent and essential utilities, and they're severely cost burdened if they're paying more than 50% of their income on these costs. As you can see, the problem is most severe as the income levels get lower.
This is very useful data. Can I follow up if I have further questions about this?
Oh yes, absolutely. And if there's anything I can't answer, I can put you in touch with advocates at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'd like to share one final point with you. Many people wrongly believe that extremely low-income people are already served by federal housing policy because of the perceived prevalence of vouchers and public housing units. But the truth is that only 1 out of 4 households that needs housing assistance actually receives it right now. And due to inflation, an increase in the HUD budget is needed each year just to maintain programs at their current levels. For this reason, we want to see an increase in affordable housing resources. Can I ask for Representative Smith's support in making sure HUD is funded at the highest levels possible to ensure that everyone has a safe, accessible, and affordable home?
I know that the Congresswoman values the programs that HUD operates, and we will certainly take a strong stance to defend those funding levels. Unfortunately, we're in a tough budget environment, so I don't expect us to get very far beyond flat funding for programs this year, but we will certainly push to increase resources where we can.
Thank you. We appreciate her support, and we'll be sure to follow up with any additional information that might be helpful.
Great, thank you for stopping in today. I'll be sure to share this information with the Congresswoman.
Thank you, Courtney and Lindsay, for that role play. It was really good. And that was just an example of a pretty standard meeting. A variety of things can happen. So, we urge you to be flexible. And sometimes you can have a meeting with a staff person or a member of Congress who doesn't really agree with you supporting affordable housing programs, and they may have some challenging questions. So we're going to go over some difficult questions that you may be asked and how to handle those. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Oh, I forgot to ask if anyone had questions. I don't think anyone had any questions right now, though. All right, so these are a few examples of some difficult questions, so you can get a sense of how to react in the meeting when you're shown some opposition. While we're going through this, if you have any questions that you come up with your own that you would like feedback on how to respond, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them today. Okay. One question that we hear a lot is, how are we going to fund more housing?
One solution that you can discuss in the meetings is protecting and expanding the National Housing Trust Fund. So, for example, you can say the Housing Trust Fund is the only federal housing program exclusively focused on providing states with flexible resources targeted to serve households with the clearest and most acute housing needs. My organization supports efforts to expand the Housing Trust Fund through any infrastructure bill, housing finance reform, and any other legislative avenues. By law, 90% of Housing Trust Fund dollars must be used for the production, preservation, rehabilitation, or operation of affordable rental housing. And up to 10% of those funds can also be used to support homeownership activities for first-time home buyers who are very low income. The Housing Trust Fund is currently supported by a required assessment on Fannie and Freddie Mac, and this can be expanded through a housing finance reform or an infrastructure package. This example that I just showed is a very, very technical answer, but it's also okay if you decide to speak more broadly about funding federal solutions to address the shortage of affordable and available homes. And we can always help you out with practicing.
Another question you may get is, what can Congress do about this, and what solutions can Congress offer?
Congress has offered significant solutions for many years through programs that are proven to be effective. They just need to be funded to an appropriate scale to make sure that the impact meets the need brought on by the housing shortage. We hear on our end from local leaders that they need greater resources from the federal government to be able to address homelessness and affordable housing.
What about state or local governments? Aren't they better equipped to handle their unique challenges with housing and homelessness?
They can be better equipped, yes, in terms of the actual administration of programs. And I think that's why programs such as the Community Development Block Grant Program have a consolidated plan, and that's worked on at the local level, or even housing choice vouchers that are distributed through the local public housing agencies. But state and local governments on their own don't have the resources to make an impact on the grand scale that the federal government can. And that's why we need to look to the federal government for solutions.
Another challenging question you all may get is, aren't you concerned that these programs will just lock people into a condition of poverty and make people dependent on continuing to receive these programs or receive assistance from these programs?
It's common to think that there needs to be accountability for low-income people who receive housing assistance, but the fact is many people who receive housing subsidies are not eligible to work because they are elderly or have a disability. Of those who are eligible to work, most of them do. If you look at your housing profile at nlihc.org, you'll see that we've broken down extremely low income households to reflect who is participating in the workforce, who is a senior, and who cannot work due to a disability or a caretaker responsibility. And at most, 10% of extremely low income households can be thought of as choosing not to work, but even then, it's more than likely that we just don't have data to put them in one of the other categories that I just mentioned. But very often people don't make enough money or face other barriers such as childcare and transportation. So work alone does not necessarily solve someone's ability to afford their home. But what we do know is that people who are receiving housing assistance try to work every bit as much as people who don't receive housing subsidies, and in some cases, probably more.
Thank you, Sid.
Of course.
All right, thank you so much, Sid and Gabby, for walking us through those tough questions. Let's see if we have any more questions from the audience. We had a question that Joey answered in the chat, but just wanted to uplift this answer. So Capitol Hill Day isn't necessarily for a set time. It'll be for the full day of March 24th, but everyone will have meetings scheduled at different times. And actually, because it's virtual, you have the option to schedule meetings at later dates if you have a conflict on the 24th. The goal is to have as many meetings as possible that day, but there is some flexibility. So your organizer will likely be in touch if they haven't been already about scheduling, or if they haven't and you want to reach out directly, you can find their contact information on the map that Joey just dropped in the chat. Any other questions? If not, we just have a few more slides before we wrap up. As you may know, we have a second webinar next week on March 16th at 12 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be going over our policy priorities. Please make sure to tune into that webinar, as it will answer your questions about specific policy asks to include during your Hill Day visits. And before we end today's webinar, on the next slide, we just want to let you know that there are some other ways you can be involved with NLIHC. The first is through NLIHC membership. Our role at NLIHC is to elevate your voice on Capitol Hill, and membership contributions support this work. So please consider becoming a member today, and you can learn more about joining as a member, whether as an individual or as an organization, by clicking the link in the chat or going to nlihc.org/membership. And finally, here's some contact information so you can stay in touch with the field team. Anytime you have a question about Hill Day, housing policy, how you can get more involved, please don't hesitate to reach out. Getting to hear from you is really our favorite thing about our jobs. So that brings us to the end of our program. I want to thank you all for attending. And again, please tune in next week for our webinar on policy priorities. And we'll be sending out a follow-up with all of these resources, slides, everything you need to know. And again, feel free to be in touch if you have any questions.